And the title of the day was Hoggalumby. Yesterday was an intriguing day for me. For only 3 years has it been a day that has honored the First People. By the way, that's an Australian term, the First People. And that's the term I would like to use. Why? How long have they been here? 18 to 20,000 years. I was brought up, and the day signified a Genovese who bumped his ship into the Bahamas in 1492. That's 500 years. And you see, if you think about that, and I wish you would, if you think about that, that's the background to what Her Grace is sharing with us. First People who numbered, by the time Columbus got here, 700,000. There were less than 200 on his 3 ships. Dr. Martinez, we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone again, and we are focusing today, I'm going to stick this here so it doesn't fall over. We are focusing today on the Dakota War of 1862 and its aftermath and its connection to the broader Civil War that we've been talking about whenever I come to see you. This is something I don't talk about a lot, so I have more notes than I usually do, and I might stay a little closer to them. So when we think of the Dakota people, right, Dakota is a word that was used by the people of the 7 council fires, as they called themselves. So it's a confederated nation, similar to the Iroquois, the Powhatan, right, these confederacies of the East Coast that we are maybe more familiar with. Although, is anyone here from the Midwest? Okay, so there are people for whom the Dakota are more familiar. This is not something I grew up hearing about in Pennsylvania. So the word that they used to describe themselves, Dakota, means alliance. The word that is perhaps more familiar to us, Sioux, the Sioux people, comes from a word of the Anishinaabe people or Ojibwe people, one of their neighbors, frequent rivals. The Ojibwe people called the Dakota a word that I can't remember, I did not write down, but it ends in the syllable Sioux. And the word meant snake. And we're not sure if that's a compliment or a critique, but it is the word that the Anishinaabe people had for the Dakota, who they frequently were at war with in the 1516 and 1700s. And the Anishinaabe people had a strong alliance with the French, right? And it is their word then for the Dakota people that Europeans adopted, or at least the part of it they could understand, which was the final syllable, Sioux. And so that's how the Dakota people, for many Europeans, become known as the Sioux. Their historical lands took up much of the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys and the western Great Lakes regions. Over the course of the 1700s, they are kind of pushed inward, particularly pushed west, so that because if you imagine, I didn't put the map up here because I put this picture from 1863 of a Dakota woman and her child as our sort of cover picture. But if you imagine the Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, right, that's where the name comes from, and pushing northward into Canada, and then immediately to their east in Canada was Anishinaabe territory. And over the course of the 1700s, the Anishinaabe, with their guns from the French, pushed inward into Dakota territory. So that by the time we get the first official treaties with the US government, the Dakota territory has already shrunk and and they're no longer in kind of the Wisconsin and Michigan areas to the same extent they'd been. So, shifting forward, this is a familiar story, broadly speaking. I think what's really interesting to me in the context of the Civil War is how recently these events occurred. The last major U.S. government treaty with the Dakota people in what's now Minnesota is 10 years before the Civil War starts. So this is not a generation or 2 generations removed the way it is for many Eastern Native peoples. This is very recent, right, that they have ceded much of their territory. So let's talk about the different treaties and sort of what happened over time. Primarily, the Dakota, of course, were made up of these 7 councils, the 7 different confederated nations. 2 of them, by the 19th century, are existing in what's now Minnesota. And that's the area we're really focusing on because that's the area where the Dakota War took place. In 1805, the Sioux Treaty that the United States government signed, again using somebody else's word for the Dakota people, basically gave the U.S. government access to build forts, river forts in particular. So they looked at all of the major rivers and particularly river junctions in the Minnesota Territory, and they wanted to build a fortification on each of them. So the 1805 treaty was really about access to just enough land to build a fort, but it's the foothold, right? It's the starting point. And a lot of these early treaties are about fortifications and controlling transportation, right? That once the U.S. government has access to the river routes, then they're going to start building roads and canals and other ways to go through Native territories, build outposts for trade, right? It's part of the long process of civilization, right? That's a Jefferson administration policy in 1805 to have the Native people become more dependent on the U.S. government for their food, for their necessities, so that they will stay in one place and give up as much of their land as possible in exchange for U.S. government protection. That's all for a little while. There's not a lot of early Euro-American interest in Minnesota. It's not seen as maybe the most congenial climate by a lot of the English people arriving in, and Germanic peoples arriving in the eastern seaboard. They like the South a lot better in terms of its prospects for agriculture. The Ohio River Valley looks great. The upper reaches of the Minnesota and Mississippi and Missouri rivers seem maybe a little too far away and a little too cold. But by the 1825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin, there is definitely emerging interest in the Great Lakes region. Not unimportantly, 1825 is when the Erie Canal is completed. And all of a sudden, if you can get stuff to the Great Lakes and through and then you're going to build canals around the Great Lakes and around the waterfalls that connect the Great Lakes, and now you can get the produce of the Great Lakes region to New York, and from there, wherever you want it to go for trade. So that's going to really increase interest in Wisconsin in particular as an agricultural zone. And so the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin is really about pushing the Anishinaabe and Menominee and Ho-Chunk or Winnebago people out of Wisconsin as quickly as possible. And so they start moving west into the territory of the Dakota people. Right? And so the Treaty of Prairie du Chien sets up boundary zones and also a kind of demilitarized zone between the Sioux and the Sac and Fox, who are going to end up in what's now Iowa. Right? There's an attempt to negotiate long-standing rivalries while also pushing the Native people closer together. And one of the things the U.S. government says in 1825 in Prairie du Chien is we are not interested in the northwestern reaches of the Mississippi River. Again, right? Too far away, too cold. We're not going there. You'll be fine. Right? And so there's this assumption after 1825 that this area is fine, right? Is not going to be subject to U.S. settlement. We can already imagine where that is going. In 1830, of course, we have the Indian Removal Act, And the Indian Removal Act is about pushing Native peoples as much as possible, particularly large nations that can sign treaties west of the Mississippi River. Much of Sioux territory or Dakota territory by 1830 is already west of the Mississippi River. They've lost already much of what was east of it. There is a section you can see on the map, 1830. So these yellow sections down here are Dakota territory after Prairie du Chien. And the green sections are where the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people have moved west as they're being forced out of Wisconsin. So in 1837, both groups cede much of their territory east of the Mississippi River